So in this lesson, we're going to build a fairly simple forward kinematic tongue for this character. But although it's straightforward and fully FK, you'll see that we can add quite a bit of control to this tongue rig just using simple joints in an FK structure. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by drawing a series of joints down the length and then joints out to the side. So let's switch to a side view here. Just switch to select the skeleton joint tool, and starting at the base toward the center, I'll draw the joint nodes, basically drawing a joint on each of the edge loops. As usual, you could use a spline as a visual guide for this. Okay, the one at the end. Open up our hypergraph here. So here are all of our joints. Let me select them and change their radius, make them a little smaller. Okay. So now with these selected, I'm going to just quickly rename them. Okay. Search for joint and rename. Okay, now I'm going to display all their local rotation axes. Okay, first thing I'm going to do is reorient this last joint so that it matches the orientation of its parent. Then I'm going to rotate each of them 90 degrees so that the y-axis is pointing out to the side. So with the last joint selected, I'm going to select Skeleton, Orient Joint Tool, make sure that it's set to none, which is what we're using throughout these demos, tutorials. Okay, so now it's matching the orientation of its parent. Now I'm going to switch to component mode and click on the question mark icon, which activates the local rotation axis selection. I'm just going to select each of these local rotation axes. And rotate them 90 degrees by typing rotate -R for relative 90, 0, 0. It's rotating 90 degrees on X. Okay, switch back to object mode. I can hide these local rotation axes. So at this point, we have a basic FK tongue rig. Now we can do all the curling on all the axes. We're going to add a little more control here. I'm going to add joints which will emanate out to the side of the tongue. And that way that will give us control over folding this tongue upwards, what we call the tongue taco. Once again, that's pretty straightforward. I'm going to switch to a top view here. Hide the standard rig. Okay. So once again, I'm going to activate the joint tool. And holding down V, which activates the point snap, I'm going to snap onto the first joint. And then holding down Shift, just drag it out to the side so that it's creating a straight line. Let me change my joint tool here so that I get a smaller radius. Okay. Okay, so now with this selected, just change this radius. snap that down there. Quickly rename this. Modify, search, and replace names. We're going to call this L tongue. And then repeat that all the way down the length of this tongue. It's activating the joint tool, holding down V, snap the first one, and then shift to just drag it out to the side. Okay, and one more. Okay, so let's switch to a perspective view. We'll probably have to go in and point snap some of these joint nodes so that they reside directly on top of that center joint. Oh, we missed one here. Did we? Let's see here. Yep. Let's move this one up. Point snap it into place. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to quickly rename each of these. Going back to the modify, search, and replace names. Just quickly rename them. This will be tongue 2 FK. And so on. And the reason naming is important in this case is we're going to mirror these over to the opposite side, so having the underscore L underscore designation will help us mirror it from the left side to the right. Oops. 09. Okay. Okay, so now with that done, go in and mirror each of these. So select each joint, the root of each of the left tongue joints, and then select skeleton, mirror joint tool, open the option box. We're going to make sure that we're searching for underscore L underscore, and replacing it with underscore R underscore. We're going to mirror the behavior and then mirror across the YZ axis, which splits down the center of the character. Okay, so let's using the G key, repeat that for all the subsequent joints. Okay, so now we have our left and right joints. Now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to simply parent these joints, the left and right joint, to the nearest joint node here. Let's hide the polygons for a second. So now when I rotate this, you can see that when we reach a 90-degree angle, the left and right joints fold in on themselves, and that would be pretty bad for the geometry here. What we're going to do is we're going to create what I call an averaging joint. Let's unparent this. What we're going to do is we're going to duplicate the center tongue joint, select it, edit, duplicate. Okay, make sure we have default settings here. So delete all the joints underneath this duplicate and call it C tongue 02 AVG for average. I'm going to parent the left and right tongue joints to the new parent, the averaging joint. And then parent this averaging joint to its parent, which was the original from which it was duplicated. So if we look at the hierarchy here, we have the original tongue joint. We have a duplicate of that joint, so it has the same local rotation axes and position. We'll call that tongue average. And then the left and right joints are children of the tongue average joint. What we're going to do is, using a multiply divide utility node, we're going to negate half of the rotations on all the axes of the tongue joint and apply that negative 0.5 rotation to the tongue average joint. So for instance, this rotates 90 degrees. We'll negate 50% of that. So in essence, this will be negative 45. So we'll average those rotations and help dampen the effect of this 90-degree rotation here. Help significantly with the deformations. Okay, so to do that, let's open up our hypergraph, our script editor, clear it out. We're going to first create a multiply divide node. So in the script editor, create node, multiply divide, minus n so that we can give it a name. We're going to call this cave 01. Tongue AVG 01, so tongue average 01 MD, multiply divide node. Select that, hit enter. So here's our multiply divide node. With it selected, let's open the attribute editor. Make sure it's set on multiply, which is the default. And now let's open the connection editor. Window, General Editors, Connection Editor, and load our multiply divide node into the inputs. Okay, expand these windows here. What we're going to do is we're going to connect the rotate channels of the original tongue 2 joint. We're going to connect all of the rotation channels into the input 1 channels of the multiply divide node. So the rotates are connected into the input 1 of the multiply divide node. I'm going to select the multiply divide node, load that into the outputs of the connection editor, select the tongue 2 average joint, load that into the inputs, and then connect the output of the multiply divide node into the rotate of the tongue 2 average joint. I'm going to go back and copy and paste these results here. Reason being that if we were to duplicate this process for all the other left and right joints, it'll be fairly easy to do by just changing the numbering of these connection statements. Let's clear out the history of the script editor. So now with the multiply divide node selected, Well, first let's rotate this, the original tongue 2 joint. You can see we're actually getting double the rotations on the averaging joint. Let's go to 90 degrees here. The reason being is we're connecting the rotations of the tongue 2 joint into the rotations of the tongue average joint through the multiply divide node. So we have a 90-degree rotation in Z. We're feeding that 90-degree rotations again into this tongue average joint, but it's also inheriting the 90-degree rotations from its parent. So it's actually getting 180 degrees rotation. So what we need to do with the multiply divide node is set all of the input 2 channels to negative 0.5. And that's how we will average the rotations out. Let's select those set adder statements in the script editor and copy and paste those. Okay. So now to duplicate this process, just going to select the tongue 3 joint, Control D to duplicate. Unparent each of these, and these are going to become our averaging joints all the way down this tongue. So I'll just rename a few of them. Of course, I ended up renaming all of them. Okay, so we have our tongue average joints, and I'm going to parent the corresponding left and right joints to the proper average joint. Just selecting the left and right joint, shift selecting the appropriate tongue average joint, hitting P for parent. Okay, now I'm going to parent the tongue average joints to the appropriate parent. Although I'm doing this all manually, something like this you can see is quite repetitive and could be fairly easily scripted, especially since you likely have matching naming. Like for instance, if you match the numbering of your tongue average joint, tongue 9 average, with the joint that it's the duplicate and parent of, scripting this should be fairly simple. So next what we're going to do is simply change the numbering in the input section of the script editor so that we will apply this averaging down the length of the tongue. So here, rather than tongue average 0, 1 multiply divide, we'll change that to 2. So all instances of that tongue average 0, 1 will change to 0, 2. Then we'll increment the joint. So this is tongue 0, 3. Okay, select this, hit enter. So now we should have 2 averaging joints. Okay, there they go right there. Looking fine. We'll just quickly go all the way down the length until we finished with 9. Once again, you can see how something like this can and should be mail scripted, since it's highly repetitive and through naming and numbering, you should be able to automate something like this fairly easily. But you'll see once this is done, although this is a fairly simple and straightforward tongue rig, it's actually quite capable. It can do quite a bit, just about anything you'll need to do with a tongue. You'll be able to rotate it on all the axes. You'll be able to scale it. I wouldn't recommend translating it. You'll throw off your local rotation axes. And with the side joints, you'll be able to fold the tongue up or down. So quite a bit of flexibility. Okay, thanks for bearing with me as I change these numbers out. Just a couple more to go here. Yeah, this is the type of tongue rig I personally like to use. If this FK style tongue is appropriate, which often it is. But once again, it's very simple, I think, and surprisingly flexible. You'll see that once you start building and posing this, you can get quite a bit out of it. Okay, one more. Okay, actually completed this. Okay, so show our geometry. So now what I'm going to do is parent this tongue to the jaw joint, the second jaw joint. So select the child, shift select the parent, hit P. So now this is in the hierarchy. It's going to get all the head rotations. I'll do a simple bind. Even with the default binding, you'll see that we'll get fairly close to an end result. The geometry is fairly simple, so you'll tend not to need much work on this in terms of the deformations. So with the joints and the geometry selected, skin, smooth, bind skin, smooth bind. Once again, our defaults for this tutorial, selected joints, closest distance. Okay, so there we have it. Once again, these are defaults. So there's our tongue taco. We can fold it up. And curling on all the axes. And because we have those averaging joints, we're not getting the folding in on itself. Okay. Once again, pretty simple and straightforward tongue rig. Fully FK, but surprisingly flexible, particularly when you add in the side joints, which have not only rotation but scaling control, and scaling control on all of the tongue joints lengthwise. But they also have the averaging on the rotations, so that you can get fairly extreme sideways rotations, actually rotations on all the axes, and still maintain a sense of volume with the tongue here. Like for instance, if we were to do this, select this and fold it in on itself, and grab one of these side joints and scale it, we can still do a lot to help smooth out that kink and preserve volume. Okay, so there's the FK tongue joint rig.